We're going to cover 4 additional examples for factoring by grouping, 4 problems you can see here. We'll start with our first example. We're going to step through this one step at a time. So we're going to group up our first 2 terms. We're going to look for a GCF here. So I'm looking at that 25 and the 35. Those are both definitely divisible by 5. So I'll be pulling a 5 out in front. And we've got an n cubed and an n squared. We can pull 2 n's out of each term as well. When we factor out a 5n squared, that'll leave us with a 5n here, and out of the 35 is going to leave us with just a 7. So we're going to do the same thing for the last 2 terms. We'll group those up and look for a GCF as well. 40 and 56 are both divisible by 4. I believe they're both divisible by 8 as well. Yeah, both divisible by 8 as well. So let's bring an 8 out in front, and we don't have n's in both terms, so it's just going to be an 8 out in front. 40n divided by 8 is going to give us 5n. 56 divided by 8 is going to give us 7. So we've done the first step. We factored a GCF out of each group. Now we look at the binomial that's left behind in each term, and we notice that they are identical. So those 2, we're going to pull that factor out into the front of this whole expression here. So I'm going to pull out that 5n plus 7 out to the front, and what's going to be left behind after we do that is going to be a 5n squared and an 8. Check and see if either of those will factor any further. There's no common factor in either one of them, so that's going to be our final answer for this one. We've got 5n plus 7 and 5n squared plus 8. Second example, let's go ahead and group up our first 2 terms and factor out a GCF. 32 and 8 are both divisible by 8. And we got a couple of b's we should be able to pull out of each of those 2 terms. When I factor out an 8b squared, we'll be left with a 4b minus 2. All right, so second and last 2 terms, we're going to factor out a GCF, 12b and 3. 12 and 3 are both divisible by 3. And that's all we're going to be able to pull out here. So, boy, I messed up that first example. Let me take a step back here, folks. When I factored an 8b squared out of 8b squared, that should have just been a 1 there. Okay, factoring a 3 out is going to give us a 4b minus 1 as well. And I realized that I made a mistake because I was about to end up with 2 factors that were not identical here. So, but let me just double check. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're good to go now. So we do have 2 identical factors. We're going to take those 2 things, we're going to pull them out in front of this entire expression. So this 4b minus 1 is going to come out in front, and what's going to be left behind will be an 8b squared and a positive 3. Let's see if we can take any of these factors any further, and I don't believe that we can, so I'm going to call it quits at this point. 4b minus 1, 8b squared plus 3 will be our final answer. All right, next example. We're going to start as we usually do by looking for a GCF. We've got a 56 and a 16 here, so I'm going to find the biggest thing that I can pull out of both 56 and 16. They are both divisible by 4. They're also both divisible by 8. 56 is not divisible by 16, so I think 8 is going to be the biggest we can pull out here. We've also got at least 2 x's in each of those terms, so we should be able to pull an x squared out. So dividing out, the 8x squared is going to leave behind a 7x and a negative 2. Doing the same thing for the last 2 terms. We want to factor out a GCF. We got 35 and a 10, and those are both divisible by 5. So we'll pull a 5 out in front. That's going to leave behind. Now that was a negative 35, so this would be a negative 7x, and positive 10 divided by 5 would be plus 2. All right, so as I move on to try and do the next step, I notice that my 2 binomials are not identical. They're really close, so the only thing that's screwed up here is the sign. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step back for that second set. Rather than factoring out a positive 5, let's factor out a negative 5 instead, and that should fix the problem. When I factor a negative 5 out of 35, that'll give me a positive 7x. Factor the negative 5 out of positive 10, that'll give me a negative 2, and now they do match. Okay, so we can take this 7x minus 2 and we can pull it out in front of the whole expression. So we'll pull that 7x minus 2 out in front, and what's left behind is going to be an 8x squared minus 5. Check and see if there's anything else we can factor out of either of those terms, and I don't believe there are. So our final answer then is going to be, pardon me, 7x minus 2 times 8x squared minus 5. All right, here's our last factoring by grouping example. Following the same steps as before, we'll take our first two terms, we'll factor out a GCF. Now, there's nothing that goes into both 4 and 3, but we can pull a b squared out of both of these terms. So that's going to leave behind a 4b minus 3 here. Last two terms, 20 and 15 are both divisible by 5, so let's pull a 5 out in front. That's going to give us a negative 4b and a plus 3. So we've run into the same situation as the last problem. These two binomials are very close, but they don't quite match. The signs aren't quite there yet. So rather than factoring out a plus 5, let's try and factor out instead of negative 5. When we factor a negative out of a negative 20, that's going to give us a positive 4b this time. And 15 divided by negative 5 would be negative 3. So now our two binomials match. And we can go ahead and pull that matching factor out into the front of the entire expression. We're going to have a 4b minus 3 out front. And what's left behind will be a b squared minus 5. Just checking to see if we can factor any further. Neither of those factors goes any further. So our final answer will be 4b minus 3 times b squared minus 5.